I stood before my father's casket as the scent of lilies turned sour. Suddenly, Elena leaned in, pressing her lips against Mark's in a sickening display of ownership. She then tipped her glass, spilling deep red wine across my black funeral dress. "Oops. Poor thing," she sneered. "They think this divorce settlement leaves me with $0, but my father's final gift will kick them to the curb tonight. My name is Clara Vance, and today I am burying the only man who ever truly loved me." I stood alone in the center of a cavernous funeral hall in downtown Seattle, my feet aching from hours of motionless grieving. The air was thick, a suffocating mixture of overpriced lilies and the cloying, oily scent of industrial floor wax. It felt like the atmosphere itself was trying to crush the breath out of my lungs. Every person in this room was wearing black, yet the air was heavy with a hypocrisy so dense I could almost taste it on my tongue. They were here for the legend of Arthur Sterling, the man who built an empire from a garage. But I was here for my father. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open with a theatrical thud that silenced the low hum of the organ music. Mark, my husband of 5 years, stepped into the room. He wasn't alone. Elena, the woman he called his sister, was clinging to his arm like a parasite. They didn't look like they were attending a funeral. They looked like they were walking the red carpet at a premiere. Mark wore a charcoal suit that probably cost $5,000. His hair slicked back with military precision. Elena was in a cocktail dress that was far too tight and far too short for a house of God. Her lips painted a shade of red that screamed of celebration rather than mourning. They marched down the aisle, ignoring the judgmental whispers of the guests. When they reached me, standing just a few feet from my father's closed casket, Elena didn't offer a hug or a word of condolence. Instead, she reached up, cupped Mark's face with her manicured hands, and pulled him into a deep, lingering kiss, right on the lips. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. It was a sickening display of ownership, a twisted declaration of a bond that defied every social and moral boundary. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic thud of disbelief. "Mark," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "What are you? What is this?" Elena pulled away, a predatory glint in her eyes. She reached for a glass of red wine from a nearby service table, her movements fluid and rehearsed. As she stepped toward me, she made a clumsy, exaggerated stumble. I didn't even have time to move before the dark. Blood-red liquid splashed across the chest of my black silk mourning dress. The cold moisture seeped through the fabric, chilling my skin. "Oops. Poor thing," Elena sneered, her voice dripping with a fake, high-pitched sympathy that made my skin crawl. "I guess I'm just so overwhelmed with grief that I've lost my balance." Mark let out a sharp, dry laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. He didn't look at the stain on my dress. He didn't look at my tear-stained face. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, manila folder. He tossed it onto the podium right next to my father's funeral program. "Let's stop the theatrics." "Clara," Mark said, his voice cold and transactional. "The old man is gone, and the clock is ticking. I've had my lawyer draw these up. It's a clean break. We sign the divorce papers now, before the state swoops in and freezes every cent of the Sterling estate. We can all just move on with our lives." I looked into his eyes and saw nothing but naked, shivering greed. He and Elena looked at me as if I were a wounded animal, a weak girl who had just lost her only shield. They believed I was nothing without my father's shadow to hide in. Across the room, I saw the board members of Apex Biotech Solutions. Mr. Henderson, my father's oldest friend, took a step forward, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane. He looked ready to call security, his face flushed with a fury that mirrored my own. I caught his eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. Not yet. I needed them to believe they had won. "You want me to sign this?" "Here," I asked. My voice trembling. In front of him. Especially in front of him. Mark replied, leaning in close so only I could hear the venom in his breath. He's not here to save you anymore. Clara, you're 100% alone. Sign the papers and maybe I'll let you keep enough money to buy a new dress. I reached out and picked up the heavy fountain pen Mark held out to me. My hand was shaking, but it wasn't because of the fear they expected. It was a cold, crystalline rage rising from deep within my soul, a frost that was hardening my heart into something unbreakable. I looked at the document. It was a standard no-fault filing, or so it appeared on the surface. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. I could feel Elena's eyes burning into the side of my face. Her breath hitched in anticipation of the payday she thought was coming. I scrolled my signature across the bottom of the final page with a jagged, final stroke. Mark snatched the folder back the second the ink was dry. He exchanged a triumphant, ugly look with Elena. They had what they wanted. They believed they had just secured 50% of a multi-billion-dollar legacy. They had no idea that by signing that paper, I hadn't just ended my marriage. I had just sprung the trap my father had spent his final months building. "We're done here," Mark said, tucking the folder away. "Don't bother coming back to the house tonight. Clara. We've already had the locks changed." I stood there, the red wine staining my chest like a fresh wound, watching them walk away. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The sun was setting on their world, and they were too blinded by their own reflected glory to notice the darkness closing in. Our 5 years in that sprawling glass villa overlooking the Sound were a masterclass in deception. Mark played the role of the devoted husband with the precision of a Broadway veteran. He would bring me coffee at 6 a.m, whispering about our bright future, while he was already calculating the market value of my father's soul. I was the one pulling 60-hour weeks as a project manager at Zenith Frontier, drowning in virtual reality code and high-stakes deadlines, while Mark claimed to be seeding new tech startups. In reality, those startups were nothing but black holes designed to swallow my 6-figure salary and every bonus I ever earned. Elena was the ghost that haunted our hallways, a permanent fixture in our private life. She was always there, lounging by our infinity pool or raiding my closet. Mark insisted on providing for her, claiming she was a fragile soul who had never recovered from their parents' passing. Every month, thousands of dollars of my hard-earned money vanished into her designer handbags and European vacations. "Marky, I really need that new SUV." She would whine, her voice a grating, high-pitched needle in my ear. "My old one is so embarrassing. You wouldn't want your sister looking like a pauper, would you?" And Mark would just smile, patting her hand before turning to me with a look that dared me to complain. I was too exhausted to fight. I was too busy keeping our heads above water to notice that he was tethering weights to my ankles. The signs were there, hidden in the mail I was too tired to read. I started finding credit card statements in my name for accounts I had never opened. There were charges for $10,000 at jewelry stores in Las Vegas and $5,000 at luxury spas in Aspen. When I confronted Mark, the gaslighting began. It was subtle at first, then suffocating. "Clara, your memory it's failing you again," he would say, his voice dripping with a fake, practiced concern. "You signed for those cards last Christmas. Don't you remember? You were so stressed. Maybe the pressure at Zenith Frontier is finally breaking you." I began to doubt my own sanity. I would stare at the statements, wondering if I truly was losing time. Elena only made it worse. She loved to remind me of where I came from, mocking the very foundation of my life. "Your father was just a grease monkey with a lucky patent. Clara," she would sneer while sipping a glass of vintage Bordeaux that I had purchased. "He's a self-made man from the dirt. It's no wonder you're so obsessed with money. It's in your common blood." The atmosphere in the house shifted from cold to predatory the moment my father, Arthur Sterling, received his terminal diagnosis. The heart disease was aggressive, leaving him with less than 6 months to live. Mark didn't offer comfort. He offered checklists. He became obsessed with the estate, his eyes lighting up every time the doctors mentioned a decline in my father's vitals. I started overhearing the whispered phone calls late at night. Mark and Elena would huddle in the library, their voices low and frantic. "The downtown properties alone are worth $20 million," Mark whispered during one of those sessions. "Once the old man kicks it, Clara won't know what hit her. We'll split the commercial leases 50-50. But what about the villa Elena asked?" Her voice trembling with greed. I want the master suite, Marky." I stood outside the door, my heart freezing in my chest. But the final blow came when I checked our personal home equity line. Mark had secretly forged my signature to take out a massive second mortgage on our villa. He had sucked out nearly $800,000 in cash to fund a lifestyle of gambling and excess with Elena, leaving the property on the verge of foreclosure. It wasn't just a betrayal of the heart. It was a systematic, cold-blooded execution of my financial future. They hadn't just stopped loving me. They had decided to erase me. As I stood in that dark hallway, listening to them laugh about their future wealth, I realized I was living with two parasites who had been feeding on my life for half a decade. The man I had slept next to for 1,825 days was a stranger, and the woman he called his sister was his accomplice in a crime that was only just beginning. 3 days before the world went dark, my father called me into his private study. The room smelled of aged mahogany and the sterile tang of the medication that was failing to keep his heart beating. He looked smaller than I remembered, a frail silhouette against the backdrop of the Seattle skyline, but his eyes were as sharp as flint. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he slid a thick, leather-bound ledger across the desk toward me. "Clara, my sweet girl, sit down," he whispered, his breath hitching as he fought for air. There isn't much time left for pleasantries." I opened the ledger and felt my breath catch in my throat. Inside was a list of 15 commercial properties located in the heart of downtown. High-rise office buildings, luxury retail spaces, and warehouse complexes I had never heard him mention in my entire life. These weren't just investments, they were a kingdom. "I've lived a quiet life, Clara," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his pale lips. I kept the true scale of my success hidden for 20 years, for this exact reason. I needed to see who would stand by you when they thought there was nothing left to take. He leaned forward, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the desk. "I know about Mark. I know about that woman he calls his sister. I've known about their disgusting arrangement for a long time. I hired a man, a professional, to watch them when you were too blinded by love to see the truth." A cold shiver raced down my spine. My father had known. While I was drowning in self-doubt and gaslighting, he had been standing guard in the shadows. He introduced me to a woman sitting in the corner I hadn't noticed before. Julianne, an estate lawyer with a reputation for being a shark in a silk suit. Together, they had spent months constructing what my father called a legal fortress. "You must sign these." "Clara," he urged, pushing a stack of legal documents toward me. "Mark must never suspect. These papers move the ownership of your villa into a private trust, a trust he can never touch. It strips him of every legal claim he thinks he has. You must be silent. You must be strong." I picked up the pen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Why now, Dad?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because when they think you are at your weakest, when they attack you the hardest, that is when the trap will spring," he wheezed, his chest heaving with the effort. "Let them be greedy, Clara. Let them show the world exactly who they are." His passing came only 72 hours later. It was too sudden, too convenient for Mark. I found my father in his bed, his face twisted in a mask of distress that didn't look like a natural end. while Mark was in the other room, already calling real estate agents. I went to my father's computer. Hidden in a double encrypted folder, I found the final piece of the puzzle, a digital recording from the night before he died. I hit play, and the sound of Mark's voice filled my ears, stripped of its usual polished charm. "You're going to die anyway, you old bastard," Mark hissed on the recording, the sound of a struggle muffled in the background. "Sign the deeds over to me now, or I will make sure Clara's life is a living hell. I will break her. I will leave her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back." I heard my father's labored gasping, a sound of pure agony that tore through my soul. "Never. You will. You will get nothing," my father replied, his voice a ragged edge of defiance. I sat in the dark of that office, the glowing screen reflecting in my tear-filled eyes. I didn't cry for his death. I cried for the pain he endured to protect me. Right then, on the edge of his empty bed, I made a silent, blood-bound vow. I would not just leave Mark. I would destroy him. I would take every ounce of greed that fueled him and Elena and turn it into the very fire that would consume them. I would make them pay for every breath they stole from him. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julianne Vance's office, blurring the neon lights of the Seattle streets into smears of cold blue and gray. Julianne sat across from me, a woman whose reputation for legal ruthlessness was matched only by her silence. She wasn't related to Mark, despite the shared last name, a coincidence I now saw as a poetic irony. She slid a thick blue folder across the mahogany desk, her expression as unreadable as a tombstone. "I've finished the preliminary deep dive into their backgrounds," Julianne said, her voice a low, steady hum. "You might want to hold on to something. Clara. The hole they've dug is much deeper than a few secret bank accounts." I opened the folder, and the first thing I saw was a birth certificate. It wasn't Elena's. It was a record of a domestic partnership from 10 years ago in Nevada. My breath hitched. "Elena isn't his sister, is she?" I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "No," Julianne replied firmly. "She's his ex-fiancée. They've been together since university. He reinvented her as his sister the moment he targeted you. It made it easier to keep her in the house, to keep her close to the money without raising your suspicion." I felt a wave of nausea, but I pushed it down, replaced by a cold, analytical detachment. I turned the page to a spreadsheet of financial liabilities. "They've been busy," Julianne continued, pointing to a column of red numbers. "Mark and Elena have opened 8 separate black credit card accounts using your social security number and forged digital signatures. As of this morning, they've racked up a combined debt of $200,000. Every cent spent on luxury travel, designer jewelry, and high-stakes offshore gambling. And my father's retirement fund?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. Julianne pulled out a series of hospital surveillance stills and bank withdrawal slips. "While your father was lying in his hospital bed, barely able to hold a spoon, Mark was using a handheld scanner to forge his thumbprints and signatures. They drained nearly $50,000 from his liquid pension in just 4 days. And look at this. These photos were taken by the private investigator at 2 a.m, the very night your father passed away." The images showed Mark and Elena at an upscale casino, laughing over flutes of champagne and stacks of high-value chips. They weren't mourning. They were throwing a victory party before his body was even cold. "There's more," I said, sliding a document I had found in my father's personal safe toward her. It was a lease agreement for the villa we had lived in for 5 years. Julianne scanned it, and for the first time, a small, predatory smile touched her lips. "This is brilliant. Mark thought he was the master of the house, but this property is owned by a shell corporation called Aegis Holdings. Your father bought that company 20 years ago. Mark has been dutifully paying $3,500 in rent every month to a landlord that was actually your father's private trust. He's been paying his own father-in-law for the privilege of living in a house he thought he was going to inherit. And Elena, I asked. I heard her on the phone this morning. She's contacted an auction house. She's trying to liquidate your mother's antique jewelry and the Sterling family heirlooms. Julianne confirmed. She wants cash, and she wants it fast. But she doesn't realize those items are specifically listed as non-transferable assets in the trust I helped your father set up. Attempting to sell them is a felony. Julianne then turned to the divorce papers Mark had forced me to sign at the funeral. She tapped the third page with a polished fingernail. Mark is an amateur, she said. He added a clause trying to claim 50% of all current and future holdings. But the way it's phrased, combined with the admission of debt he unknowingly signed in the fine print, makes this document a legal suicide note. By signing this, you didn't give him half of your wealth. You gave him full legal responsibility for the $200,000 in debt he created, while forfeiting his right to any trust-protected assets. I leaned back, a dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. I pulled out my phone and showed Julianne the decrypted files from my father's home security system. There were logs of the psychological pressure Mark had applied, the way he would scream at my father for hours when I wasn't home, threatening to put me on the street if the old man didn't change his will. The stress of these sessions is what triggered the final heart attack, I said, my voice cold and hard as a diamond. I have the digital footprints. I have the recordings. I have everything. Then we have enough, Julianne said, closing the folder with a definitive snap. They think they've won the war at the funeral. They're currently back at the villa, celebrating. Let them get comfortable. Clara, the higher they climb on their mountain of lies, the more bones they'll break when they fall. I returned to the villa to find the heavy mahogany front doors standing wide open, a cold wind whistling through the foyer. My life was being discarded in real time. My silk dresses, my leather-bound journals, even the framed photographs of my mother, all of them had been unceremoniously shoved into tattered cardboard boxes and strewn across the hallway floor. Upstairs, the master suite was a crime scene of vanity. Elena was standing in front of my vanity mirror, wearing my favorite ivory Chanel suit, the one I had planned to wear to the next board meeting at Apex. She was generously spraying my signature scent onto her neck. A smirk plastered on her face as she caught my reflection in the glass. This silk feels so much better on me than it ever did on you. Clara, she said, her voice dripping with a cruel, honeyed sweetness. It was always such a waste on a plain little mouse like you. Downstairs, the house was crawling with vultures. Mark had invited a dozen high-end real estate agents and luxury brokers to what he called his freedom party. The smell of expensive catering and cheap ambition filled the air. He was walking them through the gallery, pointing at the art my father had collected over 40 years as if he were the one who had earned it. This property will be on the market by Monday morning, Mark announced to a small group, his voice booming with a false authority. We're looking for a quick sale. $12 million minimum. My wife and I have decided to pursue separate paths, and I'm liquidating my half of the assets immediately. He saw me standing near the grand staircase and his expression hardened. He strode over, his face inches from mine, smelling of expensive scotch and victory. What are you still doing here? Clara, he hissed, loud enough for his guests to hear. We're done. I have the signed papers in my pocket. You have 30 minutes to get your trash out of my house before I call the Seattle police and have you hauled away for trespassing. You're nothing but a squatter now. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply turned and walked into the darkened corner of the library, sinking into the shadows of my father's favorite armchair. I pulled my phone from my pocket and activated the remote recording app. They thought they were alone when the guests moved to the patio for appetizers. Elena walked into the library, leaning against Mark's chest. Is she gone yet? I can't stand the way she looks at us, like she's actually important. She's a ghost. Elena. Mark laughed, his hands wandering over her waist. She just doesn't know she's dead yet. 5 years of playing the doting husband. 5 years of listening to her boring stories about virtual reality. I deserve every cent of that old man's money for the sheer boredom I endured. Elena giggled, a chilling, high-pitched sound. The old man was the real problem. He was so loud that last night. Marky. Just shouting and gasping for help. I just needed him to sleep for a little while. A few drops of my special wine in his glass was all it took to make sure he couldn't reach the call button. He looked so surprised when he realized he couldn't breathe. My blood turned to ice. She had drugged him. She had watched him die. "You did great, babe," Mark whispered, kissing her forehead. Now we just wait for the probate court to process the papers she signed today. 50% of everything. We'll be in the south of France by next month. They had no idea that every word was being transmitted to a secure server. They also had no idea that the small, blinking blue lights in the crown molding weren't smoke detectors. My father had installed a military-grade surveillance system 6 months ago, and I was the only one with a biometric key. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was a message from Julianne. "The judge has signed the emergency order. The eviction is sealed. The trap is set. Go to the safe in the library." I stood up and walked toward the desk, ignoring their startled looks. Mark stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "I told you to leave. Clara, are you deaf? Get out before I lose my temper. I'm just checking the paperwork." "Mark," I said calmly, pulling a duplicate of the folder he had used at the funeral from the desk drawer. Mark sneered, reaching into his pocket to pull out the original document he had forced me to sign. "Look all you want. It's a standard divorce filing. 50-50 split. You signed it in front of 50 witnesses." He flipped to the signature page, his eyes scanning the fine print for the first time with actual focus. As he read, the color began to drain from his face, turning him a sickly shade of gray. His hands began to shake so violently the paper rattled. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice breaking. This isn't the division of assets. This says I acknowledge a debt of $200,000 to the Sterling Trust, and that I waive all rights to marital property in exchange for the dismissal of criminal fraud charges. Clara, what did you make me sign? I didn't make you do anything." "Mark," I replied, my voice as cold as a winter grave. "Your greed signed that paper. And now, your 30 minutes are up." The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the breakfast nook, casting long, mocking shadows across the marble table. Mark and Elena were already there, hunched over a tablet, their voices filled with the manic energy of thieves who thought they had gotten away with the haul of a lifetime. I could hear snippets of their conversation: first-class tickets to Paris, a villa in Tuscany for the summer, and a shopping spree on Avenue Montaigne. They were spending money that didn't belong to them, fueled by a victory that didn't exist. As I stepped into the room, Mark didn't even look up at first. He reached into his silk robe, pulled out a pre-written check, and flicked it across the table. It slid over the smooth surface and hit my hand. $5,000. "Clara," Mark said, his voice flat and dismissive. "Consider it a parting gift. Take it, get your things, and never show your face in this neighborhood again. If you're still here by 10 in the morning, I'm calling the authorities." Elena let out a sharp, jagged laugh. She was wearing my favorite silk robe, sipping coffee from my mother's porcelain cups. She gestured toward the dried, dark stain of red wine still clinging to my chest from the night before. "You really should change before you leave." "Dear," Elena smirked. "That wine stain. It really is the perfect accessory for your pathetic little life. It makes you look exactly like what you are. A mess." I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for the check. Instead, I pulled a thick embossed folder from under my arm and placed it gently on the table, right over their travel brochures. I opened it to the first page, the deed of the Sterling Trust. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Mark," I said. my voice as calm as a frozen lake. You should read the third paragraph. Carefully. Mark rolled his eyes but snatched the paper. As his eyes moved across the legal text, the smug expression on his face began to dissolve, replaced by a sickly, gray pallor. This says the villa is owned by a private trust, he stammered, his fingers tightening on the edges of the document. But we've lived here for 5 years. I've paid the bills. This can't be right. It's very right. I replied. This house was never marital property. My father bought it through a shell company before we even met. You haven't been building equity, Mark. You've been a tenant, and according to the papers you signed yesterday, you've officially waived any right to claim residency. Mark's breath hitched. He looked like he was suffocating. But the money, the investments, I put everything into those startups. Those startups were failing shells. Mark, I said, leaning in closer. My father knew you were using my salary to fund them, so he did something brilliant. He used his own capital to quietly buy up every single one of those predatory loans and debt notes. You don't owe the banks anymore. You owe the Sterling Trust, which means you are officially a debtor to your own wife. Every cent you thought you were investing now belongs to me. Elena's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She knocked her coffee cup over and lunged across the table toward me, her fingernails aimed at my face. You lying little bitch, she shrieked. We worked too hard for this. I'll kill you before she could even get close. 2 burly men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. They were the private security team I had retained through Julianne. One of them caught Elena's arm mid-air, pinning her back into her chair with effortless strength. She began to shake, her voice breaking into a high-pitched, jagged sob. "Get your hands off me," she screamed, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Mark. Do something. Mark didn't move. He was staring at the folder as if it were a coiled cobra. I've already filed a formal report with the district attorney's office. I continued, ignoring Elena's hysterics. Identity theft, 8 counts of credit card fraud, and the forgery of my father's signature on his pension documents. They're reviewing the digital footprints as we speak. In a final desperate act of cowardice, Mark grabbed the documents and tried to rip them in half, his face turning a deep, violent shade of purple. He shredded the paper into white confetti, throwing it into the air with a roar of frustration. I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that silenced the room. Those are just copies. Mark, I said. The originals are currently sitting in a vault at the police station, right next to the statements from your bookie in Las Vegas. Just then, both of their phones chimed simultaneously. Mark pulled his out, his thumb trembling as he swiped the screen. His face went completely white. "My accounts," he whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with a sudden, crushing terror. "Everything. It's all frozen. The cards, the savings, it's all gone. There's $0. Elena, it's all 0. I stood up and smoothed out my dress. You have 25 minutes left. I'd suggest you start packing your trash. The library doors creaked open, and Miller, my private investigator, stepped into the room. He wasn't alone. Walking behind him was a woman in a faded blue tunic, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking so violently she had to grip her elbows to stay upright. It was Sarah, the night nurse who had been responsible for my father's care during his final week. Mark's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. Elena's grip on my silk robe tightened until her knuckles turned ivory. "Tell her, Sarah," Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The nurse looked at me, a sob breaking from her throat. I'm so sorry. Clara, she came to me at midnight. Elena offered me $5,000 in cash just to leave the house for 2 hours. She told me it was a family matter, that they needed privacy to say goodbye. I didn't know he was in distress. I didn't know he was dying until the sirens woke me up the next morning. You lying cow, Elena screamed, lunging toward the nurse, but my security team held her back. Is that all? Miller? I asked, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. Not quite. Miller replied. He tapped a command on his tablet, and the large television on the library wall flickered to life. The footage was grainy but clear. It showed the interior of my father's medicine cabinet from 1 week ago. Elena was there, her movements hurried. She opened my father's heart medication bottle, dumped the contents into a plastic bag, and replaced them with identical-looking white capsules. Those were sugar pills, I said, turning to look Elena in the eye. You didn't just let him die. You ensured he couldn't survive. You stole his heart medicine and replaced it with nothing. Mark suddenly fell to his knees, his hands reaching out toward me in a pathetic, desperate gesture. Clara, please, listen to me, he sobbed, the tears streaming down his face. I didn't know about the pills. I swear on my life. It was all her Elena is. She's a monster. She manipulated me. She's the one who wanted the money. Please, give me a second chance. We can start over. We can be a family again. Elena froze. She looked down at the man who had been her partner in crime for 10 years, her expression shifting from terror to a cold, jagged fury. You coward, she whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying intensity. You're going to throw me to the wolves. After everything we did, after you told me how easy it would be. She turned to me, her eyes wild. You think he's innocent? Clara, you think he just started being a killer now. Ask him about your mother's car accident 15 years ago. Ask him how a 20-year-old college student suddenly had $40,000 to pay off his gambling debts 2 weeks after she was buried. The room went deathly silent. The air seemed to vanish from the library. My mother's death had been ruled a tragic accident, a brake failure on a rainy night. My father had never truly recovered from the grief. What did you say? I whispered, the words barely finding their way past the lump in my throat. He did it. He did it for the insurance payout your father gave him as a wedding gift, Elena hissed, her voice a jagged blade of truth. He cut the lines. He watched her drive away, and he laughed while you cried at the funeral. He's a predator, Clara. He's been eating your family alive for more than a decade. A wave of tattered, freezing agony washed over me, but I didn't break. I felt the weight of my father's hand on my shoulder, a phantom presence urging me to finish this. I pulled my phone out and hit the play button on the recording from the funeral. Mark's voice filled the room. He's not here to save you anymore. Clara, you're 100% alone. Sign the papers and maybe I'll let you keep enough money to buy a new dress. As the recording finished, the library doors opened once more. 3 men in dark, expensive charcoal suits walked in. I recognized them immediately, the executive board of Apex Biotech Solutions. Mark Vance, the lead executive, said, his voice echoing with a cold, professional disdain. As of 8 o'clock this morning, your consultancy contract with Apex has been terminated for cause. We've reviewed the evidence of your fraud and the ethical violations regarding the Sterling estate. You are finished in this industry. Every firm from here to New York knows your name now. Mark slumped onto the floor, his eyes vacant. He had no money. He had no career. He had no soul. He was a hollow shell of a man facing 25 years to life in a state penitentiary. Elena saw the writing on the wall. She turned and bolted toward the back servant's entrance, her heels clicking frantically on the marble. But as she threw open the door, she stopped dead. The backyard was flooded with the rhythmic, pulsing glow of red and blue lights. Dozens of Seattle police officers stood there, their weapons drawn, their voices a synchronized roar of authority. Elena Rossi, put your hands in the air! She backed into the room, her chest heaving, her eyes darting around like a trapped rat. I stood in the center of the library, the daughter of Arthur Sterling, finally stepping out of the shadows. "It's over," I said. I raised a hand to the lead police officer, stopping him just as he reached for his handcuffs. I didn't want them taken away in the quiet of a private library. "A snake needs to be defanged in the light of day so the whole world can see its true colors." I turned to Julianne and gave her a sharp nod. Within minutes, the same real estate moguls and social climbers who had been drinking my father's scotch the night before were ushered back into the grand foyer. They arrived with a mix of confusion and predatory curiosity, sensing that the power dynamic in the room had shifted violently. I stood on the landing of the grand staircase, looking down at the crowd. Behind me, Mark was slumped against a pillar, his eyes darting like a cornered animal, while Elena was being held by security, her face a mask of sweating, desperate arrogance. "Thank you all for returning," I said, my voice echoing through the marble hall. "Last night, you were invited here to witness a sale. Today, I've invited you to witness a confession." I gestured to the massive digital display in the foyer, usually reserved for displaying fine art. Instead, it flashed a series of documents the Nevada partnership between Mark and Elena, the forged signatures on my father's pension, and the wire transfers of $200,000 to offshore gambling sites. The gasps from the crowd were sharp and immediate. The brokers who had been shaking Mark's hand an hour ago now stepped back as if he were covered in plague. "They aren't siblings," I announced, watching the socialites whisper behind their hands. "They are partners in a decade-long fraud. Mark Vance is not a consultant. He is a thief. And Elena Rossi is not his sister. She is his accomplice." Elena tried to sneer, but it came out as a pathetic, quivering grimace. She was still wearing my mother's vintage diamond necklace, a piece worth nearly $50,000. "Take it off." "Elena," I said, walking down the stairs until I was inches from her. "The necklace, the suit, the shoes, every single thread you are wearing belongs to the Sterling Trust. You are wearing the skin of a family you tried to murder." She looked at the security guards and then at the mocking faces of the people she had tried to impress. With trembling fingers, she unhooked the diamonds and threw them at my feet. I signaled to Sarah, the nurse, who handed Elena a small plastic bag. Inside was a cheap $10 set of oversized gray pajamas I had found in the back of the laundry room. "Change, now," I commanded, "or the police will do it for you at the station in front of the cameras." 10 minutes later, Elena emerged from the guest bathroom. The transformation was complete. Gone was the high-fashion predator. In her place stood a woman in baggy, pilled cotton, her feet bare on the cold marble. She stood in the exact spot where she had poured wine on me during the funeral. I picked up an open bottle of vintage red wine from the catering table, a bottle that cost $2,000, which Mark had opened earlier to celebrate his freedom. I walked toward her, the dark liquid swirling in the glass. "You said it yourself, Elena," I whispered, tilting the bottle. "It's such a shame to ruin a good outfit." I slowly poured the deep, crimson wine over her head. It soaked her hair, matted her cheap pajamas, and dripped onto her face. She stood there, frozen, a sob of pure humiliation breaking from her lips. "Oops, poor thing," I said, my voice loud enough for every guest to hear. Now you're actually pathetic." The room erupted into a jagged, cruel laughter. The very people she had looked down upon were now filming her with their phones, capturing her descent into total disgrace. Mark crawled toward me on his knees, his face wet with tears and snot. "Clara, please, don't do this. Don't take the house. Where will I go? I have $0. Please, I'm your husband." I looked down at my watch, the coldness in my heart finally settling into a peaceful, icy stillness. "You have exactly 30 minutes to get out of my sight," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "The police are waiting at the gate. If you aren't packed by then, not that there is anything left for you to pack, they will drag you out in front of the news crews currently parked on the sidewalk. Clara, please, it's so cold outside, he whimpered, his voice cracking. I'm sure the prison cell will be much warmer, I replied. The clock is ticking. Mark, 29 minutes and 50 seconds. I turned my back on them, walking toward the library to wait for the final act. Behind me, the sound of the crowd's mockery followed them as they were forced to gather their lives into 2 tattered trash bags. The heavy wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate groaned as they swung open one last time for the man who thought he owned them. Mark and Elena were practically tossed onto the sidewalk, clutching 2 bulging black trash bags that held nothing but old shoes and some worn-out gym clothes. The designer suits, the silk robes, and the stolen watches had all been stripped away. They stood there in the chilling Seattle mist, looking like the very wreckage they had tried to make of my life. Waiting for them at the curb was Julianne, her silhouette sharp against the flashing blue and red of half a dozen police cruisers. Beside her stood several stern-faced officers and 2 state bailiffs holding a stack of official warrants. Mark Vance, Julianne said, her voice carrying a terrifying, rhythmic finality. You are being placed under arrest for grand larceny, 15 counts of financial fraud, and a charge of indirect homicide. Your relentless psychological pressure and the documented threats against Arthur Sterling are being cited as the primary triggers for his fatal cardiac event. The color drained from Mark's face until he looked like a marble statue of a coward. Homicide. No, you can't. I didn't touch him, Clara. Clara, tell them. One of the officers stepped forward, spinning Mark around and cinching the steel handcuffs around his wrists with a sickeningly metallic click. Mark let out a strangled sob, his knees buckling. Then the lead officer turned to Elena, who was trying to blend into the shadows of the gatehouse. Elena Rossi, you are under arrest for attempted murder, the unauthorized practice of medicine, and identity theft. We've confirmed you were stripped of your nursing license in California 10 years ago for narcotics abuse. Replacing a cardiac patient's medication with sugar pills is a felony that will likely keep you behind bars for the next 20 years. It wasn't me. I was just doing what he told me. Elena shrieked, her voice cracking as the cold reality of a prison cell settled over her. Marky, help me! As they were being shoved toward the back of separate patrol cars, a sleek black sedan pulled up across the street. A woman stepped out, leaning against the door with a cigarette in one hand and a mocking smile on her face. It was Vanessa, the woman Mark had been seeing behind Elena's back for the last 18 months. Mark froze, his eyes widening in shock. Vanessa. Why are you here? Vanessa took a long drag and blew the smoke toward him, her eyes filled with a dark, satisfied glint. I'm the one who gave the private investigator the bank records. Marky, you thought you could screw me out of that $50,000 you promised for my consulting work. You thought I wouldn't notice you were planning to fly to Paris with this gutter rat instead of me. Elena let out a guttural scream of betrayal and tried to lunge at Mark, but the officers held her firm. Vanessa just laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the sirens. You're broke. Mark, Vanessa shouted as they shoved him into the car. That empire of yours was built on 100% debt. And guess who signed as the primary guarantor on those $300,000 business loans your sister, Elena, did? Even if you both get out of prison in 30 years, you'll be paying me and the Sterling Trust until the day you die. I watched it all from the highest balcony of the villa, the one overlooking the Sound. The flashing lights reflected in the glass. A chaotic dance of justice. For the first time in 5 years, the air in my lungs felt clean. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was a confirmation from the bank every cent of the $200,000 stolen through fraud had been recovered by the insurance bonds and the trust's legal safeguards. I turned away from the railing and walked back into my father's study. Julianne had left a tablet on the desk with a single file queued up. It was a video recorded by my father on the night before he died. I hit play. The screen showed Arthur Sterling, looking tired but incredibly peaceful. He smiled at the camera, a look of pure, paternal pride in his eyes. "Clara, if you're watching this, it means you've won." His voice was a soft, steady rasp. "I am so sorry I had to put you through this, but I had to be sure you were ready to lead. This was your final test. You stayed strong when they tried to break you. You chose logic over emotion. You protected the legacy I built for you." He leaned closer to the lens, his expression softening into the man I remembered from my childhood. "Don't look back at them, Clara. They are the past. The world is yours now. Go and do something beautiful with it. I love you so much." I sat there in the silence of the great house, the video looping on his smiling face. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't a wife to a ghost. I was Clara Sterling Vance, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely free. Justice in the American legal system can be slow, but when it arrived for Mark and Elena, it was absolute. Mark was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security facility without the possibility of parole, his crimes of grand larceny and indirect homicide finally catching up to him. Elena received 15 years for her role in the medical fraud and identity theft. I heard from Julianne that they spend their days in prison writing venomous letters to each other, each blaming the other for the greed that consumed them. They are rotting in the very hatred they cultivated. While I have finally begun to breathe, I didn't keep the millions for myself. I used a significant portion of the recovered assets to establish the Arthur Sterling Foundation. We specialize in providing legal and financial sanctuary for women trapped in marriages defined by economic abuse and psychological manipulation. I remember sitting with the first woman we helped, a young mother who had been gaslit for nearly a decade. You aren't imagining things," I told her, squeezing her hand. "He's not smarter than you. He's just louder, and we are going to make him very quiet." I sold the glass villa for $14 million. It was a beautiful structure, but it was haunted by the echoes of 5 years of lies. I moved into a minimalist penthouse in a high-rise looking out over Elliott Bay. There are no dark corners here, only floor-to-ceiling glass and the endless horizon of the Pacific. At Apex Biotech Solutions, I finally stepped into the role I was born for. As CEO, I am no longer managing virtual reality projects for entertainment. I am overseeing the production of the very cardiac monitoring devices that might have saved my father if he had been given a fair chance. I am surrounded by his true friends now. Mr. Henderson sat in my office just last week, leaning on his cane with a tired but happy smile. "Arthur knew this was in you, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He told me once that you were like a diamond. You just needed enough pressure to show how unbreakable you really are. A year has passed since that cold day at the funeral home. This morning, I stood before my father's grave under a rare, brilliant Seattle sun. I wasn't wearing black anymore. I wore a silk dress the color of a clear summer sky, a deep, vibrant blue that spoke of hope rather than mourning. I knelt down and placed a copy of the morning newspaper on the granite. The front page headline detailed the final recovery of every cent stolen by Mark's fraudulent shell companies. "It's done, Dad," I whispered, my voice steady. "The debt is paid. Every single penny." The final surprise came later that afternoon when I finally opened an old safety deposit box my mother had left in my name. A box that was only to be surrendered on this exact anniversary. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age, written nearly 20 years ago. "My dearest Clara," the letter began in her elegant script. "Your father and I have seen the world, and we know its predators. We have seen the way certain people look at our success. If the man you choose to marry ever tries to use your heart as a weapon against your future, know that we saw him coming. We established the sterling trust 2 decades ago as a shield. We wanted you to know that even when we are gone, you are never, ever truly alone. I sat on the floor of the vault and cried, not out of sadness, but out of a profound sense of peace. I realized then that my victory wasn't just about the money or the revenge. It was about a legacy of love that was stronger than any lie Mark could ever tell. I was the centerpiece of a 20-year plan designed by 2 people who loved me more than life itself. I walked out of the bank and onto the bustling streets of downtown Seattle. The air was crisp, and the sun felt warm on my shoulders. I didn't look back. I didn't check for shadows. I am no longer a victim of a husband's greed or a sister's spite. I am the architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel. Like this video and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.